Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon. We are about to begin our session titled A Columnist Voice, a conversation about a life lived with passion. I will introduce to Ms. Umber Khairi. Umber Khairi is a columnist, writer, and journalist. She is one of the founder of the independent journalist owned magazine New Line. And she was a producer and radio broadcast at the BBC World Service in London for almost 2 decades. Over to Umber Khairi.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this session. We are talking today about this book. It's called A Life Lived with Passion, Irfan Husain, 1944 to 2020. So as most of you probably know, Irfan Husain was a very popular and widely read columnist with Dawn for 3 decades or more. And he passed away in 2020. This book is a collection or a selection of some of his Dawn columns. And it was commissioned, it's a posthumous publication, so it was commissioned by his son Shakir Husain and his wife, his widow, Charlotte Grace, after Irfan passed on. So we are having a discussion about it, and with me here, Victoria Schofield. She's a historian and a researcher and someone who has a long association and a deep interest in Pakistan. Agha Imran Hamid, who's a development consultant, and he's a very old friend of Irfan, and also somebody who shared Irfan's passion for food, which many of us know about through knowing him, but also through his columns, because he also wrote about food very well. Khawar Mumtaz has joined us from Lahore via Zoom, and she's going to be with us in the session. She's, of course, a human rights and activist. She's done a lot of work for women's rights. She's been associated with Women's Action Forum, Agha, and has been head of the National Commission on the Status of Women. So we all knew Irfan personally. And even though I knew him personally, I have to say, when I came to the book, I thought, how interesting is a collection of newspaper columns actually going to be? Because I'm a columnist, I've been a journalist for a long time, and I've seen a lot of these vanity projects where people just get all their columns from, whatever, as many years as they can, and they just put them together and they think people would really like to read them. So I was, okay, it would be nice, it's by Irfan. But I have to say I was really surprised by how readable they are. And I actually really enjoyed it. And that was a surprise, I think. And we'll have, we can talk about also this whole genre of newspaper columns, collections, whether it works and how this fits in to that. The collection has been edited by the journalists Abbas, Nasir, and Carmen Gonzalez. They were with the BBC World Service. They were editors there for many years. And Abbas, Nasir, of course, is a former editor of Dawn. So, I think a lot of the success of the volume has to do with how the columns are selected and put together. So I thought they can't be with us because they're actually somewhere where they don't have access to good broadband. But they did send us a little video about the whole process of how they took on this challenge. So if we could just hear from them first. The video. How do you look at 3 decades worth of, or more, of columns and then put them together? as Abbas and Carmen. Perhaps we can come back to the video later. हम वीडियो पे बाद में आ जाएंगे जब उसका ऑडियो आप सॉर्ट आउट कर देंगे, ठीक है? Apologies for that. We will sort out the technical issues at some point. But yeah, so on this question of Victoria, if we can come to you first, on the question of, this whole genre of newspaper collections and publishing, is this something you actually read? How do you look at it, and how do you rate Irfan's, this book within that genre?
Well, thank you, Umber, and it's lovely to be here, actually talking about a friend, because I think all of those of us who were privileged to know Irfan, he was a great friend, and I actually call him a Renaissance man, because he had such wide-ranging interests. Of course, it is difficult to have a book of columns that you've written, and it might not have come off. But I think there's 2 points, really. One, that Irfan was such an exceptional writer. He was very pithy. He got to the point. They were good columns. They were amusing to read anyway. And then the other thing, we do have to pay tribute to the 2 editors, because what we're reading in the book are only some of his columns. And they themselves, I think, we'll probably hear from them when we can hear from them. Initially, they thought, how do you make sense of a whole lot of columns that are on this very eclectic set of subjects? And so the first thing when you look at the book is that you see that they've managed to divide up thematically into several themes, some of his columns. So you're not getting a chronology, because the way the subjects work is that you might get 1996, you might get 2003, then you might go back to 1997, but they're more thematic, and I think that's one of the reasons why the book's successful. And we have to point out that there's the very important early topics. The second section is the fractured society, and then you've got political, on the politics, and then you've got the faith matters. And it's just typical Irfan. You've got the final section, which is on the menu, which I'm sure you'll also talk about, which is his love of food and the importance of food. So it's not, by definition, it can't be boring, because it's got so many interesting vignettes into life as he saw it, and into the issues as he saw it. At the same time, you've got Pakistan's history evolving through these columns. And that's why I think it works. It's not a very common, you say, how does it fit in within the genre? It's not very common for people to put together their columns. I mean, maybe, they might like to, and make it work. You do it sort of as a record. But I think it's one of a kind, partly because Irfan was such a great writer, and partly because through his writing, his personality comes through. And it's just, it works for that reason.
Yes, I think it's a lot to do with the editing, the selection, and the arrangement, and then obviously the quality of the writing. Imran, how did you sort of respond to?
First of all, let me thank the organizers and our moderator for giving me the chance to speak to all of you. The reason I say this is because I'm not a public intellectual by any means. I'm simply a friend of Irfan's and an avid reader of his columns. In fact, I read most of these columns when they first came out in various newspapers under various names. But it was still astonishing when I went back to it, when I dipped into it, and in fact read substantial chunks in order to be able to speak to you about it. title of this session is, Do Columns Have a Retire-by Date? Well, perhaps the more immediately topical or technical or stodgily written ones do. But there is a whole class of columns, and they are few in number, which are not. Foremost amongst them, I should name my late friend, also a mutual friend of Irfan's as well, the late Iqbal Ahmed, whose writings are in a class by themselves. But quite close comes Irfan. And then, of course, there's also Khalid Hassan, whose writings are still interesting to read, more because of the use of language and, let's face it, the slightly gossipy nature of the columns. But they're quite an enjoyable read. Irfan's, however, this is work I'd like to describe to you in a little more detail. If you take a look at the book itself, and by the way, it's well worth the effort to actually read this book. And I promise you, you will enjoy it if you're a reader. If, however, you're more into watching TikTok or YouTube, that's another issue. Irfan describes his beliefs very succinctly in an early chapter in this book, which is called Credo. Credo means I believe in Latin. It's part of the Latin Mass, and that's not accidental. I mean, he would pick on phrases like that because if you look at the main point, and I'm singling this out, Irfan was a very secular person. This, I think, defines the key to much of his writing. If you see a lot of stress here on religious fundamentalism and a lot of anger vented at this, the wonder is not that he spoke about it so much, but that he was able to restrain himself, given what has been happening in this country. The other point about Irfan is that he had a very strong moral foundation. Now, given the almost flippant style in which he writes, you might not think so, but if you read the book, you'll see that there's a very strong thread of a moral thread in the book. That's one point. The other is that he had a very keen interest in the world around him. He had both breadth of knowledge and depth. And he was always learning. And you'll see this in his columns. I mean, he writes with great wonderment about so many things, which he's just read about at the late age of 65 or something. And he communicates that sense of wonder to his readers as well. And the last thing that I would like to mention in this context is that he had a way of picking on things that are important. And all three of these points will be illustrated in the chapter on morality and power. Now, I don't know how much time I have. I wouldn't mind reading you a few excerpts, but perhaps, should I? Okay, if you'll permit, because I think this illustrates the point very well. The very first passage that I'd like to read, as it happens, is very, very topical. And I quote, "As the Israeli destruction of Lebanon continues unabated, it is clear that the international community has decided to play the role of spectators. Nothing new here, not even the Muslim world's complicit silence. By pulverizing Lebanon and killing hundreds of civilians, the Israelis are doing nothing more than reminding us of their power as well as their contempt for Arab lives. Hezbollah is showing the world that the Jewish state's regional monopoly on armed might is slipping away." He goes on to say, in this new colonial era, which is the era after the Cold War, Washington and Moscow controlled much of the world through proxies, and it seemed that this would continue well into the future. Now, this article was written in 2006, and he's pointing out that this era is slipping away. So I'd like you now to move to the context of today and see where we stand with this. He mentions the failure of the UN, And the reason for the failure, which is the interplay of the great powers, but principally the United States. He had no hesitation in pointing that out. And the particular hypocrisy of the Israelis in continually pointing to the campaign of extermination waged by the Nazis, known as the Holocaust, but to use that as a cover for their own policies, apartheid, the murders, the expulsions, the ethnic cleansing that the Israelis have waged. And the phrase that he used was with regard to both America and Israel, jiski lathi, uski bhais, which means whoever owns the stick owns the buffalo. Um, he goes on to talk about the changes that are occurring in the world, the rise of China. Um, he always brings in the subcontinent whenever he's discussing things, and he never fails to take a dig at the Pakistani establishment as well. So all that is here in this one article written in 2006. So that's one facade of his work. But the very last thing I want to say to you is that he was also capable of acknowledging errors in judgment. There's a chapter in here called Mea Culpa, another piece of Latin, from the Latin liturgy. It means my sin. And he points to his defense of Benazir and the People's Party. For years, after many of his friends had been telling him that there is massive corruption going on, that she and her husband are not likely to achieve anything because they don't really want to. And he acknowledges all this. Nevertheless, I must say, he retained a certain regard for her, and that comes out in what he wrote about her at her death. And he speaks more with sadness than with anger about what is past. So I leave it there for the moment, and I think it might be a better idea if people have specific questions about him that I can answer later.
Yes, Imran, you stole two of my passages. I had marked out the same one from 2006, which was as true for the situation with Israel as it was then. And also the Benazir Bhutto thing, we will come back to that because that's an interesting column, which starts off with saying, my son Shakir wrote to me and said, oh, can't you see this? You're too much of a piplia, Abba. And then he sort of said, oh, okay, let me look at it again and things. And but he was a great admirer and a great supporter of Benazir Bhutto and the cause, and I think he had a lot of empathy for minorities and a real concern for the status of women. And if we go to Khawar, you can hear me, yes?
Can you be a little louder, please?
Oh, okay. So we were just talking about how Irfan's had a lot of empathy and a lot of concern for minority rights and empathy for women, and that comes through in his columns. Now, you've known him for a very long time, and you're also family. So tell us a bit about his writings, how it involved, and whether this is an accurate reflection of him as a person. Because he started writing very early on, I think in the Star in the 80s or something. The 80s, yeah.
Yes, first of all, really, I'm glad to be here. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but to talk about Irfan, to pay tribute to him, I really feel grateful that I'm with this panel. Well, I think you're right. I remember Irfan writing first as Irfan Hussain, as Shakir Hussain in his son's name. For a long time, his columns were by, and I remember Irfan laughingly saying that Shakir is saying that now I'm going to take credit for all those columns when I apply for universities and colleges. And then he went on to Mazdak. Of course, he's extremely. I think very important is the fact that his articles reflect him and his concerns and his personality. When he decides to take on the name Mazdak, he's very clear why he's taking it. He admires Mazdak for his rebellion and repression. I mean, in that column, Rebellion and Repression, he talks about how Mazdak is remarkable, whose socialistic ideas and reforming zeal made him a target for the establishment, and his end was violent and bloody. And he describes in detail the end, how he comes to an end. But he was obviously attracted to Mazdak. His pacifist teachings stand out, and in a generally bloodthirsty era. So he identifies as a rebellious writer. He's rebelling against the establishment, but also is wary of what can be the result of it. So I think he very sort of consciously took on this role, and he writes about it. He also says in one of his columns later, when his reflections before a fireplace, he says it's anger that drives him. And then we see over the columns, as the years go by, a time comes when he's writing about, when he says that when he's suddenly 60, he feels that he's now tired. Cynicism has taken over. All that incisive writing, pointing to all these issues, and he was very reflective as well as incisive. He suddenly feels that he's been at it, he's mellowed down, and maybe he's become cynical. Although I do feel that his zeal continues right till the end when he's writing. But the zeal, the interest, his very strong faith in morality, as Imran has just pointed out, and his very strong. I mean, his canvas is so wide. Secularism, of course, is his faith. He's extremely upset about inequality in society, fundamental rights, regional peace, history, and of course, religious fundamentalism just gets he's most upset about it. And then the tolerance. At the same time, he's also it sees how things have moved very fast with technology, and especially when he talks about communication and the shorthand communication that we've come to from writing long letters, thoughtful and communicative. So I mean, there is a whole range of things, and most important from the point of view of minorities and women. I don't think any of the issues of the time, Malala, Mukhtara Mai, I mean, you name it, and he's done work on it. On the Kohistan girls who were murdered for honor for having clapped in a hujra, to to whole, the Women Protection Act of 2006, which made it easier, say, watered down the hudud ordinances, the zina ordinance. Sorry, I have to cough. So I think his views were vast, but what I think was also made his columns so much more interesting was a wry humor, and also self-deprecation. He would make fun of himself also, and look at his shortcomings. And so it was that flavor, the way of saying things. Sometimes very angry, but at other times being able to say things because of his excellent writing capacity. And when this question of whether these columns are of any, I mean, what is their efficacy over time? I think Irfan's columns have much more depth than any ordinary columns. First of all, his facts cannot be refuted. He works hard at at getting right facts, goes into history, and his depth of entries and history and understanding gets reflected. So in that sense, it's become a much more almost. For instance, I was reading Mukhtara Mai's the column about Mukhtara Mai. He's really taken apart the role of Musharraf, General Musharraf. He's actually encapsulated that whole incident in those 3 pages. So it's almost like a reference material. You go back and you get all the details of the case. Similarly, about Malala and how the extremists in Pakistan and also some of the others were, conflating her situation with drones and with American policies. I mean, the way he exposes all those, the hypocrisy, the dualities. I think that's what makes these columns that much more interesting, and the way they're written. Absolutely, the way they're written, and then the references.
mentioned the Malala Yousafzai, I mean, how he takes on topics, but what I actually enjoyed was that he, throughout, has a very, very polite tone. So even when he's writing about Malala and how the media has treated her, and he's also, berating his friend and a fellow columnist, Ayaz Amir, it's all done very politely. And so he would make some very strong points, but in a very accessible and a sane tone. And I think that's part of the strength of these columns, and that's what actually makes them very accessible even across borders. Because I know that this family did receive some feedback from somebody in England who was nothing to do with Pakistan really, except he might have known or met Irfan, and his feedback was, I'm enjoying these so much that I'm sort of limiting myself to 2 columns a day because I'm enjoying them so much and I want them to last longer. So Victoria, I mean, do you think these columns are accessible to people who are of interest to people who are not necessarily interested in this region?
I think, well, actually, there's sort of 2 questions within that, because I would add to the generation that didn't know Irfan as well, both in this region and they're not in this region, because I think we're all reading it. We either read them in the newspapers when they came out, or we reread them because we know Irfan's personality, and it does come through with what he's written. And you're right, he writes in a polite fashion, even when he's talking about issues which are very important. He doesn't, you can have sort of things which are, as we would say, in your face, and it kind of jars. Even if it's the truth, you kind of withdraw and react from it because you think, okay, well, I know that, but I don't want to be told that in that fashion. And that, I think, is one of the strengths and will allow the book to endure. There's one that I just quickly noted down. It's in, needless to say, the section on a fractured society, and so he's talking about Pakistan, and he concludes, this is in 1995, when there's a certain amount of difficulty going on, and we've had the MQM, and he says, ultimately, nobody is out to get us except ourselves, and we are doing a very good job of it. And it's just a sort of, it's a turn of phrase. I mean, but it doesn't offend. So I think the fact that the tone is familiar, it's easy to read, it's still topical because there are similarities with what's going on now with what's happened before, and we are interested in the past. You might say, well, why read a bunch of old columns because it's the past, but the past also illustrates the present, and we need to know about the past, and it's quite an accessible way to read about the past. So I think for the younger generation, I would also encourage them, because it gives you a little vignette. It's actually marvelously quotable. Columns are always very good because this is what people would think, what was thought at that moment in time. It might not have the depth of research of a sort of historical piece of writing, but it captures what was going on at the time and what the general opinion was at the time. In terms of beyond Pakistan, it's tricky. I think you've got to want to know about Pakistan and what was going on. So by definition, someone like myself, well, I knew Irfan anyway, would find them interesting. With great respect, you're probably not going to get an enormous readership beyond, unless you're looking and you're doing a piece of research, particularly for what the mood was at that moment in time. And you might get sort of foodies thinking, oh, well, there's this Pakistani, I wonder what he thought about this. You might get, for the last chapter, and that's kind of readable and accessible. But, it's the same with any book. It doesn't appeal to everybody. And that as an author and as a writer, you know that. And not everybody is going to be reading every book. And that's good. It should be. We need diversity and we need variety. But I think, the bigger picture is that here was somebody that we were all very fond of. And it's marvelous that in one volume you've got a selection of what he wrote, compiled, that can be handed on to future generations, indeed the family, friends of the family, rather than the trouble about being a columnist and a newspaper writer is that, the newspaper goes, that the article's gone. It's not like, I write books and my books are a little more durable. But whatever I've written in newspapers, unless I've cut it out and stuck it in a, scrapbook, it's gone. So I think this is wonderful, and it sort of in a way it gives closure to his writing, because we're not going to have any more writing from Irfan. So it's wonderful that we've got a book which covers this wide panorama of his interests and his thoughts, all in one volume.
Yeah, I think this is, you mentioned the selection, and I think this is probably a good time to try and bring in the editors again, if we've got the technical issues sorted out. So can we try and hear from them now? So yes, that was sunny Spain in the background, where Abbas and Carmen sent the message from. Um, Imran, Abbas mentioned the sort of level of erudition and the breadth of knowledge, and this is very interesting because he takes really a lot of, whether it's philosophy or ancient history or sort of history of religion or whatever, it's almost like a humanities course sometimes in some sections, but very accessible again. Like he gives you a lot of knowledge, and but
You're quite right. He was never afraid to learn, and he was never afraid to revise an opinion if he learned otherwise. And this is a very big thing. I mentioned to you that in his book, he's corrected himself. This is a very big matter, if you like, a political, a moral matter. But even in smaller matters of fact, he would correct himself. And this is something that shows that his mind was not just curious, he wanted to arrive at what was the most proximate correct answer, such as he felt. So yes, I strongly appreciated that about him, and of course, when somebody is that interested, they'll spark your interest as well, and he always did that. And as far as the breadth of his interest is concerned, well, that you can see from this book, but also from what his friends have to say about him.
yeah, so I mean, I just want to have one example here because there's one column, I don't know if you remember, it's Visions of Hell. And it talks about the concept of hell and how it's what hell is portrayed as across the sort of centuries and in various religions. And he says at the end of it, I think, my personal vision of hell is being locked up with crowds of shoppers in a mall in Dubai for all eternity. So it's a kind of a learned topic, and it gives you some sense of history and the history of religion. But you learn a little bit about him. And then there was another good one, which was about when he talks about people come to his house in his parents' house in Karachi, and they just look at the books and let's see. It says years ago, somebody complained about our family house in Karachi, that walking into it was like entering a library. There were books everywhere, and everyone was always reading. Fortunately, this person has not darkened our door for years. So, he has this, but there was always this emphasis on reading, on learning, on knowledge. Victoria said he's a bit of a Renaissance man. Khawar, I wonder if you'd like to come in on this.
Sorry, I didn't get you.
Would you like to comment on this? We were talking about his Irfan's breadth of knowledge and learning, and in a sense, his family had that background, but he brought it in very
Absolutely.
skillfully, in a very low-key way.
That's right. Actually, he comes from a very scholarly family. Father was, of course, erudite, but also, um, uh, you know, a Sanskrit scholar. He translated those, and he was a phenomenal wise man. And I think he had a great impact on Irfan. Irfan's mother was a great storyteller. If you've met her ever, you would have known. She was a great storyteller, but she also started writing after his father passed away. And some of the most beautifully written vignette of individuals of her own life are amazing. They're like oral history almost. So he grew up in that milieu with a lot of intellectuals, writers coming in and out of the house. And as he mentions, everybody, people thinking, what is this house just full of books? Uh, so that's what I think he imbibed the most. I mean, he had other four brothers, but I think his was the most absorption of all that was around him, especially from his father and his love for art and culture and history. I think that was something that was personal to it. So one saw a lot of it in his columns. You can see it, the amount of delving into history, the context, and I mean, he was a collector of art also, as you may know. He had Jamil Naksh, he had Shakir Ali, he had Ibn Ijaz's work. He loved it, and he would go to exhibitions and was very encouraging to youngsters also. So I think he was a very quiet way of working, and even commending people, but very, very effectively. So he certainly was a Renaissance man. I agree with Victoria there. And there were times when he would reminisce about what had been so nice, like his account of his childhood, how things have changed from then to now. So there's a bit of nostalgia there, but there's also a sense of loss. So I find his writings very, very effective and in many ways very moving, especially when he's talking about, and of course, his anger and his frustration with the bureaucracy. So I think the other remarkable thing is that he was a government officer and he stayed there till he retired. At the same time, he was somebody who was totally critical of what the government was doing. And he kept those two paths very separate in ways. I don't know how he managed it because he was a successful bureaucrat, known for his uprightness, his efficiency. He was given the task of auditing the steel mill, for instance. He was in Bhutto's secretariat. So the point is that he was a trustworthy, responsible, good bureaucrat. And on the other hand, he was this columnist who questioned everything, and probably more because knew the inside. I remember when 1970, when the our military operation in East Pakistan. And I suppose he knew more than what we knew from outside, only listening to Pakistan radio. Uh, he used to be so angry. I've never seen him so angry as at that point in time at what was happening to the people of Dhaka. So one saw that how he got that information and he kept them apart, the two worlds apart. Quite a task, I think, an achievement.
Yes, I think there's a lot in the book actually. I find it is very readable, but also it's arranged very well thematically. It's got 7 different sections, so I would encourage everyone to have a look at it. It is, available. It was published online at the Little Book Company, so it's available from them. The hardback is available at the back of the room, and there's a softback, a paperback available on Amazon. So it is very entertaining. One of my favorite sections is the on the menu section, which is about cooking, which was one of his passions, and always very, very interesting. But we could have a discussion now if anyone has any questions or comments or is familiar with Irfan's work, who has questions about the book, then probably now we can take a few.
Can I just make a comment, Umber, before we get the questions? I think what also comes out of the book is the generosity of spirit of Irfan. And, there are journalists and writers, and certainly my experience was if you wanted to know something or get some more information, he would share. Now, not all people do that, and I do think that comes out within the writing. There's a sort of a band of journalists, and I find that is a characteristic also, to add to the sort of the humor of his writing, the understatedness, but there is a generosity of spirit in it. I just wanted to add that thought, it came into my mind.
Absolutely, yeah. So,
Hi, my name is Aisha. It's a really interesting conversation. First of all, I find it beautiful that all you friends of Irfan Sahib are here doing a digital tombstone of him. I was wondering, given the fact that he was from the brand of Kavasji, Iqbal Ahmed, people who were secular and wanted, what's right for the state and, to separate religion from the state so that the state can provide for everybody blindly without being prejudiced. Do you feel there is somebody like him now writing for Dawn? And maybe you could mention a few people that we could look up to, or do we give up?
would you like to take that?
You brought up Iqbal. I'll just, in passing, mention Iqbal had a deeper knowledge of religion and religious issues than any of us, Irfan or myself. And Irfan by design, Irfan just wasn't that interested, except when he saw the manifestations. As to whether there is room for it now, yes. The fact is, we are living in an unstated under an unstated martial law. But martial law isn't new to us. And somebody like Irfan can always find a place to write. Um, the main thing I would say is that at the time when he was writing, when he was very active, particularly his early and middle periods, there was very little competition. There was print, there was the afternoon press where he started writing the Karachi afternoon papers. I wonder how many of you remember those. Star,
Star.
you know the ones I mean, the ones who shared an office with your lot. Um, and magazines. Basically, that was it. Now we've got internet. We've got, which, by the way, is a rich source of written material, not just of videos, but you also have videos. And by the way, he was he's able to give a good presentation, but simply isn't that much available. So yes, I think that there's very much room for that. If someone were able to write in that fashion, and I can think of other people who have perhaps the knowledge, others have the language, but to combine those with the kind of restraint that he did, because as Umber pointed out, he was very, very angry, and I know it. I know it as someone who's never been able to restrain myself, so it's just as well I don't inflict myself on anybody in print. But there is room for it, and I think both on television and in the written media, there is very much room for a serious thinker who can make an exposition the way he used to make.
I wouldn't give any names, but there are a number of people. But I think the newer columnists tend to root themselves more in a certain academic discipline, or to have credibility, and don't have as wide a range of subjects. So they tend to take more of a position in terms of disciplines, I think. So, but there are a lot, and the thing is, obviously, publishing has changed with the internet, so it's not the three main papers, and you look for their columnists. There's so much independent publishing, there's so many platforms, there's so many podcasts, some excellent podcasts, so I think that's where we would look now for the sort of progressive stance, or the informed, journalistic, objective content. Any other questions or comments? Any readers of Irfan, or anyone who's seen the book, if you'd like to say something? We can go back to the book then, but I would encourage all of you to actually have a look at the book. It's very readable. I think it also gives a very good snapshot of lots of things. But any particular favorites? I mean, one of my favorites was, on the menu and the culinary thing, because that's not just about cooking food. That's about culture and heritage. So, Imran, how did you look at that as what a foodie you are?
Well, I was afraid it would come to this. The fact is that Irfan and my relationship with culinary matters was not really so much about discussing things as in discussing specific recipes, planning where we would have our next meal, or where we would cook our next meal and what we would cook. So that kind of gives you a perspective on this. We were more activists than cooking writers. Now, he's written very well on matters pertaining to food, but that's the tip of the iceberg. When you compare it with his adventures in the kitchen and our mutual adventures exploring various parts of various cities in Pakistan and abroad for what we thought might be good or interesting food. He was a very decent European cook, by which I specifically mean French and Italian cuisines. He was quite competent in Pakistani cooking and would differ in matters of Chinese cooking, for example, which is another cuisine that he enjoyed very much. Beyond that, he simply took joy in it, and that's a very encouraging thing to those who are involved with him, or who are eating with him, or who are cooking with him.
I think one learns things from these columns, not just about his weight, but about his experience, but also there's a lot of information there. So I would just encourage all of you to have a look at the book and, see what it's very easy reading. It's available at the back over here. And I think our time is running out now. So any other comments?
Well,
Victoria, you want to come in?
I'll just sort of make
Can I say?
a concluding sort of commentary that we've talked about it in terms of it being journalism, but it's also social commentary on life, and I think that's what is also its staying power, because again I refer back to the comment I made at the beginning that it's thematic, but it's certainly not chronological. And if ever we feel a bit gloomy in our lives, you can read a section and see the sort of repetitive patterns that have been going on. It's not just now or yesterday, but it was the day before yesterday as well. And that is actually a value, and I think, again, for the younger generation, for all the students of sort of society as well. I mean, you can learn quite a bit about on the menu, but with the other chapters, that this is a continuity, and in a way that's the sub-theme, is that it's a continuous narrative, even though it's not a chronological narrative. And I think, again, that's why it's valuable. And I refer back to my original remark that Irfan was a Renaissance man, and the young lady in the front who questioned whether there are other writers. Maybe it's a lesson to us all to be slightly Renaissance individuals, to have a wide range of interests, not to take ourselves too seriously, and to have joy and fun, even though we're also focusing on very, very serious issues. And I think this does come out through the book, that he enjoyed life. The title is very apt, A Life Lived with Passion. He was passionately interested in the difficult aspects of life, but he was also passionately interested in the good, fun, relaxing aspects of life. So that's my sort of take home for everybody today.
Yes, I think that's very well put. Khawar, would you like to just...
Yes, yes, I would like to talk about the section on food. I mean, I am not a great cook, nor do I enjoy cooking too much unless I have to. But his columns used to always fascinate me because they were more than just cooking. It was a whole cultural experience. I'll talk to you about this particular one called Epicurious Smoking Fish, where he makes a distinction between biryani and a pulao. And then he talks about how his stepchildren, he tries to explain to them that what are the two things. One is a Delhi cuisine and one is a Lucknow cuisine. And now this is part of his cultural sort of throwback. And he then cooks. One day he cooks the biryani with all his saffron and the rose water and everything, and feeds them biryani. The next day he cooks the pulao, and obviously he's the love and sensitivity with which describes the making of the pulao. If I can, may I read that little para? He said, next day it was the pulao, and even if I say so myself, it was fragrant and very gently spiced. All the spices had been placed in a muslin bag, simmered with the chicken until it was falling off the bone. After removing the meat, the rice was allowed to cook in the yakhni or broth until it was close to being done. The pan was then transferred onto a tawa and put on dum on a very low heat for about 15 minutes. You can almost feel the cooking process. When the rice was just done, it was served to the hungry multitude. But alas, he says, I'm sorry to report that the consensus was that the biryani was better. He was in despair. Oh, well, I shouldn't have expected Goras to appreciate fine Lucknowi cuisine to the extent I do. I think it's the way he writes which makes it so much more interesting. Uh, the food, the, 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 the intensity with which he writes about the flavors and the fragrance, and each one of them has a quality about it. So I do see the people who don't want to read politics can go straight to the food section.
Yes, very true. The biryani one, yes, and
If I can
I
make a very quick comment,
very quick.
what I said to him was he should have served the pulao first.
Yes, that's one thing.
Yes,
Well,
the delicate food.
on this wonderful foodie note, we'll conclude the session. Thank you so much, Victoria Schofield, Agha Imran Hamid, and Khawar Mumtaz. And the book is available at the back of the room and downstairs, and there's probably a discount if you get it in the room. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Umber, for this moderating.
Thank you so much for joining us from Zoom.
Bye. Khuda Hafiz.